Millionaire's mute daughter spoke after poor girl gave her water. The impossible happened. Before we get into it, let's make this moment global. Leave a comment in your own language. The silence in the Hayes mansion had become Richard's greatest enemy. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library or the reverent hush of a cathedral. It was the suffocating absence of his daughter's voice, a void that had consumed their lives for 3 excruciating years. At 42, Richard Hayes commanded a business empire worth $8 billion, controlled boardrooms filled with the world's most powerful executives, and could make governments bend to his will with a single phone call. Yet he stood utterly powerless in the marble hallway of his Manhattan penthouse, watching his 6-year-old daughter Emma arrange her stuffed animals in perfect silent rows. The grandfather clock's steady tick echoed through their palatial home like a countdown to nowhere. Each chime marked another hour, another day, another month of Emma's mysterious silence. Richard's Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble as he paced between his home office and Emma's playroom, his mind racing through the same desperate calculations he'd been making for years. How much money would it take? Which expert hadn't he consulted? What treatment hadn't he tried? Dr. Patricia Walton emerged from Emma's playroom with the same defeated expression Richard had seen on 14 other specialists' faces. Her leather portfolio snapped shut with the finality of a coffin lid. At $70,000, she was the most expensive child psychologist in the country, flown in specifically from Johns Hopkins because of her revolutionary work with selective mutism. Like all the others, she had spent 2 hours with Emma, conducted extensive evaluations, and emerged with nothing but theories and apologies. "Mr. Hayes, doctor," Walton said carefully, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she studied his expectant face. "I've reviewed every single test result, brain scan, psychological evaluation, and medical consultation from the past 3 years. Emma's vocal cords show no physical abnormalities whatsoever. Her larynx is perfectly formed, her breathing is normal, and her brain scans reveal no structural damage or developmental delays. In fact, her cognitive abilities are remarkably advanced for her age." Richard's jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. "You're the 15th expert to tell me that her hardware is fine, doctor. I didn't fly you here from Baltimore and pay you $70,000 to confirm what I already know. I need solutions, not diagnoses." Emma sat cross-legged on her favorite Persian rug, a priceless antique that had once belonged to a Persian Shah, carefully arranging her collection of stuffed animals according to some private logic only she understood. Her movements were precise and deliberate, displaying the kind of organizational skills that would have impressed Richard in any adult boardroom. She understood every word of the conversation happening around her, as evidenced by the slight tilt of her head and the way her intelligent brown eyes tracked between the adults' faces. Yet she remained locked in her silent world, a brilliant mind trapped behind invisible walls. Dr. Walton shifted uncomfortably under Richard's intense stare. She had dealt with demanding parents before, but Richard Hayes operated on a different level entirely. His presence filled rooms like a gravitational field, bending everything and everyone toward his will. She had researched him extensively before accepting this consultation, a man who had built his fortune by acquiring failing companies and transforming them into profit machines through sheer force of personality and strategic brilliance. He approached his daughter's condition the same way he approached hostile takeovers, as a problem to be solved through superior resources and relentless determination. "There are experimental treatments in Switzerland," Dr. Walton offered hesitantly. "Our clinic in Zurich has been developing cutting-edge neurotherapy techniques that combine traditional psychology with emerging neurofeedback technologies. The preliminary results show promise for children with trauma-induced selective mutism, though the treatment is still in clinical trials and the cost would be considerable." "Schedule it," Richard interrupted, his voice cutting through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "Cost is irrelevant. I want Emma evaluated there within the week." "Doctor." Walton blinked in surprise. Most parents needed time to consider such drastic measures, to discuss finances and logistics. Richard Hayes had made a $250,000 treatment decision in the time it took most people to order lunch. "Mr. Hayes, perhaps we should discuss this with your wife." Emma's mother died in a car accident when she was 3, Richard said flatly. It was 6 months after the accident that Emma stopped speaking. Now you understand why I'll try anything, spend anything, to get her voice back. The revelation hung in the air like a revelation that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. Dr. Walton's expression softened with understanding, but also with the recognition that this case was far more complex than she had initially realized. Trauma-induced selective mutism following parental loss was notoriously difficult to treat, often requiring years of patient therapy rather than quick medical fixes. After Dr. Walton left with promises to arrange the Swiss consultation, Richard knelt beside his daughter on the Persian rug. Emma's tiny hand found his immediately, her fingers surprisingly warm and strong for such a small child. She pointed to a children's book lying nearby, a story about a little girl who befriended a family of rabbits in an enchanted garden. It was one of dozens of books they had read together, part of their nightly ritual that had become both sacred and heartbreaking. Richard's voice softened as he read aloud, transforming from the steel-edged tone he used in boardrooms to the gentle cadence he reserved only for Emma. She followed along with rapt attention, occasionally pointing to illustrations or turning pages at precisely the right moments. Her comprehension was remarkable. Standardized tests showed she was reading at a 5th grade level despite being only 6 years old. She solved puzzles designed for children twice her age, created intricate drawings that displayed advanced artistic understanding, and could follow complex instructions with precision that amazed her teachers. Yet she had never said, "I love you," back to him, never called out when nightmares jolted her awake, never asked for anything with words. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with all the conversations they couldn't have, all the questions he couldn't ask, all the comfort he couldn't provide through spoken reassurance. Richard's assistant, Margaret, knocked gently on the doorframe before entering. At 63, she had worked for Richard for over 2 decades, managing everything from billion-dollar acquisitions to Emma's pediatric appointments with equal efficiency. She was one of the few people who dared interrupt him during his time with Emma, and only for matters of genuine importance. "Sir?" Margaret's voice carried the careful deference she used when delivering potentially unwelcome news. "Mrs. Patterson from the Sunshine Children's Home called to confirm tomorrow's quarterly visit. The children are looking forward to seeing you and Emma again." Richard had established regular visits to the Sunshine Children's Home 3 years ago as part of his corporate social responsibility initiatives. What had begun as calculated philanthropy, tax-deductible charity work that generated positive media coverage for Hayes Enterprises had evolved into something more complicated. The orphanage visits had become a form of self-inflicted torture, surrounding himself with children who possessed the one thing his daughter couldn't give him, their voices. The irony cut deep every time. At the orphanage, he was mobbed by children eager to tell him about their drawings, their games, their dreams for the future. They chattered endlessly about everything and nothing, their voices creating a symphony of youth and hope that highlighted the devastating silence of his own home. Yet he continued the visits, driven by some masochistic hope that exposure to other children might somehow spark Emma's dormant voice. "Confirm the appointment," Richard said quietly. "Standard time and security arrangements." That evening, after Emma had been tucked into her canopy bed surrounded by enough stuffed animals to stock a toy store, Richard stood in her doorway watching her sleep. Her face was peaceful in the soft glow of her nightlight, her dark hair spread across the silk pillowcase like spilled ink. She was beautiful in the way that made Richard's chest ache with fierce protectiveness, delicate features that reminded him painfully of her mother, but with his own determined jawline already visible even in childhood. The bedroom itself was a testament to both love and desperation. Every surface held carefully chosen toys designed to encourage speech development. Interactive books that responded to verbal commands, musical instruments that required vocalization to operate, educational games that rewarded verbal participation. Child psychologists had filled Emma's world with speech-inducing gadgets and tools, yet none had succeeded in coaxing so much as a whisper from her lips. Richard's reflection stared back at him from Emma's bedroom window, overlaying the city lights that twinkled 40 floors below. He looked older than his 42 years, stress having carved lines around his eyes, and silver threads through his dark hair. The weight of single parenthood combined with running a multinational corporation had taken its toll, but it was Emma's silence that had aged him most dramatically. The grandfather clock's midnight chime echoed through the penthouse, marking another day in their wordless existence. Richard closed his eyes and made the same desperate wish he had been making for 3 years, that his daughter would speak, that her first word would be "Daddy," and that this nightmare of silence would finally end. In her bed, Emma stirred slightly, her lips moving in the peculiar way that had given Richard false hope countless times before. Sometimes she seemed to be practicing words that existed only in her dreams, her mouth forming silent syllables that never quite became sounds. Tomorrow would bring another visit to the orphanage, another encounter with children who took their voices for granted, another reminder of what his family had lost. Yet something different lingered in the air tonight, though Richard couldn't identify what had changed. Perhaps it was the way Emma had looked at him during their bedtime story, or the particular intensity with which she had listened to Dr. Walton's evaluation. Whatever it was, Richard fell asleep with the strangest sensation that their world was about to shift in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The stage was set for encounters that would challenge everything the Hayes family believed about miracles, medicine, and the mysterious connections between souls. Tomorrow would bring a meeting that would change everything, though neither father nor daughter suspected that their salvation would come not from Swiss clinics or expensive specialists, but from an orphaned girl who carried ancient wisdom in a simple glass vial. The Sunshine Children's Home sat like a beacon of yellow brick hope, nestled between towering oak trees on the outskirts of Manhattan, its cheerful exterior a deliberate contrast to the gleaming steel and glass towers that dominated Richard's usual domain. As his black Mercedes Maybach pulled through the modest wrought-iron gates, Emma pressed her face against the bulletproof window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched children playing on swings and slides that Richard's donations had installed just 6 months earlier. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the main building before their car had completely stopped, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she hurried down the front steps. At 68, she moved with the energetic purpose of someone who had dedicated her life to caring for children that society had forgotten. Her face bore the kind of laugh lines that came from finding joy in small moments, a child's first successful bike ride, a teenager's high school graduation, the countless daily victories that made her work worthwhile despite the heartbreak that inevitably accompanied it. "Mr. Hayes," she called out warmly as Richard's security detail efficiently checked the perimeter. "And sweet Emma, look how much you've grown since our last visit." She knelt to Emma's eye level with the practiced grace of someone who understood that children needed to be met on their own terms, not forced to crane their necks to communicate with towering adults. Emma smiled, a genuine expression that lit up her entire face, and took Mrs. Patterson's weathered hand in her small one. Though she couldn't speak, Emma had developed her own vocabulary of gestures and expressions that those who knew her had learned to interpret. The way she squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hand conveyed affection and familiarity, while her quick glance toward the playground revealed eager anticipation for the afternoon ahead. The orphanage buzzed with its characteristic controlled chaos, as 37 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers went about their daily routines. Richard had funded extensive renovations over the past 2 years, transforming what had once been a merely functional institution into something approaching a proper childhood haven. New computers lined the updated learning center. Colorful playground equipment replaced rusty old swings, and fresh paint in warm, welcoming colors covered walls that had previously been institutional beige. Yet despite all the improvements his money had purchased, something about the place always made Richard profoundly uncomfortable. It wasn't the facility itself or the dedicated staff. It was the constant sound of young voices that served as an audio reminder of what his own home lacked. Children called out to friends, laughed at shared jokes, sang along to music during their afternoon activities, and chatted endlessly about everything and nothing with the effortless ease that Richard envied more than any business competitor's success. "We have a special new arrival I'd very much like you to meet," Mrs. Patterson said, as she led them through hallways lined with children's artwork and achievement certificates. Her voice carried a particular warmth that Richard had learned to recognize, It meant she had a story to tell, usually one that would tug at heartstrings and open wallets. But today, something in her tone suggested this was different, more personal than her usual fundraising narratives. "Lucy Martinez," Mrs. Patterson continued as they walked past the cafeteria, where several children looked up from their afternoon snacks to wave at Emma. 7 years old, came to us 3 weeks ago after her grandmother passed away back in rural Mexico. She's been through quite an ordeal, poor thing. Her grandmother was her only living relative, and the transition to life here has been challenging. They found Lucy in the library corner, a space Richard had specifically requested be created during the renovations, because he believed books could provide children with windows to worlds beyond their circumstances. She was smaller than most 7-year-olds, with long dark hair braided neatly down her back, and secured with a simple yellow ribbon that matched her well-worn but clean dress. What immediately caught Richard's attention wasn't her size or her clothing, but the small glass vial hanging from a delicate silver chain around her neck, clearly a precious possession that she clutched protectively whenever anyone approached. Unlike the other children who had gathered at a respectful distance to stare at the famous billionaire whose picture occasionally appeared in newspapers and magazines, Lucy remained completely focused on her book. Richard could see the title, "Advanced Botany for Young Minds," a text that seemed remarkably sophisticated for a 7-year-old orphan. She read with the kind of intense concentration that Richard recognized in himself, occasionally pausing to sip from a plastic water bottle decorated with faded Disney princess stickers that had clearly seen better days. "Lucy," Mrs. Patterson called gently, her voice carrying the special tone she used with children who needed extra patience and understanding. "I'd like you to meet some very special visitors who have come to see us today." The girl looked up slowly, revealing striking green eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond her chronological age. Her gaze moved first to Mrs. Patterson with polite acknowledgement, then to Richard with the kind of direct, unblinking stare that most adults found disconcerting in children. She studied him for several long seconds, as if evaluating something important about his character, before finally shifting her attention to Emma. The moment Lucy's eyes met Emma's, something electric seemed to pass between them. Richard, who had spent years observing his daughter's interactions with other children, had never seen Emma respond to anyone quite like this. Instead of her usual shy hesitation when meeting new people, Emma stepped forward confidently and sat down cross-legged on the carpet directly across from Lucy, as if accepting an unspoken invitation to join an exclusive club with membership of exactly 2. "You don't talk much, do you?" Lucy said to Emma, with the kind of startling directness that only children possessed. Her voice carried a slight accent that reflected her Mexican heritage, but her English was clear and surprisingly sophisticated for someone who had presumably learned it as a second language. Richard tensed instinctively, ready to intervene with the protective explanations he had developed over the years, to shield Emma from uncomfortable questions about her silence. But Emma surprised him by showing no signs of distress or embarrassment. Instead, she nodded honestly and pointed to her own throat, then shook her head in a gesture that clearly communicated, "I can't," rather than, "I won't." "I don't talk much either, sometimes," Lucy continued, addressing Emma as if she had received a detailed verbal response, rather than silent gestures. "My grandmama used to say that some people talk with their hearts instead of their mouths. She taught me how to listen for the heart words. They're often much more important than the mouth words." Emma tilted her head with genuine fascination, her dark eyes lighting up with the kind of interest that Richard rarely saw her display toward other children. She pointed to the mysterious vial around Lucy's neck and raised her eyebrows in an unmistakably questioning expression. "This?" Lucy touched the small glass container protectively, her fingers tracing its smooth surface with obvious reverence. "It's water from the sacred spring behind my grandmama's house in the mountains of Oaxaca. She said it was special, that it remembers things from long ago and can help people remember things about themselves that they've forgotten. I know it probably sounds silly to grown-ups, but Grandmama was very wise about things that doctors and scientists don't understand." Mrs. Patterson exchanged a meaningful glance with Richard, her expression mixing fondness with slight concern. Lucy's grandmother was something of a local legend back in rural Mexico, she explained quietly. People traveled for days to reach her remote mountain village, seeking her help with ailments that conventional medicine couldn't cure. They called her a curandera, a traditional healer who combined herbal knowledge with spiritual practices that had been passed down through generations of indigenous women. Superstition, Richard muttered under his breath, though he found himself watching the interaction between the two girls with growing fascination. In his world of quantifiable assets and measurable outcomes, he had little patience for folk remedies and mystical healing claims. Yet something about Lucy's absolute conviction and Emma's obvious interest kept him from dismissing the conversation entirely. Lucy unscrewed the cap of her water bottle with careful deliberation, as if performing a ritual that required precise attention to detail. She took a small, thoughtful sip, then looked directly at Emma with those penetrating green eyes. "Want some? It tastes different from regular water, cleaner somehow, like it came from the first spring that ever existed. Grandmama always said it could help people remember who they really were inside, before life made them forget." Richard started to object instinctively. He didn't know this child, had no idea where her water had originated, and his protective parental instincts rebelled against allowing Emma to consume anything from an unknown source. But Emma was already reaching for the bottle with an eagerness that stopped his objection in his throat. Her eyes met his in a direct plea that communicated more clearly than words ever could. "Please, Daddy, I want to try." Against every logical instinct screaming warnings in his head, Richard found himself nodding slightly. Emma's face lit up with a smile of pure joy as she accepted the bottle from Lucy's small hands. She held it carefully, studying the clear liquid inside, as if she could divine its secrets through observation alone. Then, with the kind of deliberate ceremony that children sometimes brought to important moments, Emma lifted the bottle to her lips and took a small, careful sip. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The other children continued their afternoon activities. Mrs. Patterson chatted with a volunteer across the room about dinner preparations, and the world continued its steady rotation on its axis. Then Emma's eyes widened with an expression of pure astonishment. She looked directly at Lucy, opened her mouth and spoke her first word in 3 years and 6 months. "Thank you." The plastic bottle slipped from Emma's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor and splashing the last few drops of sacred spring water across the library carpet. Richard dropped to his knees beside his daughter so quickly that his expensive suit trousers tore against the rough carpeting, but he barely noticed. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he wondered if cardiac arrest was possible from pure emotional shock. "Emma?" His voice emerged as barely a whisper, cracked and broken with 3 years of accumulated hope and desperation. Did you really just speak?" Emma looked confused, as if she wasn't entirely sure what had happened. She touched her throat experimentally with one small hand, her eyes wide with wonder, and perhaps a touch of fear at the strangeness of having produced sound after so long in silence. Then she looked at Lucy with an expression of gratitude and amazement that Richard would remember for the rest of his life. Lucy smiled, a knowing, satisfied expression that seemed far too wise and ancient for a 7-year-old orphan from rural Mexico. She capped her water bottle carefully and tucked it into her small backpack with the reverence of someone handling a precious relic. "I told you it was special," she said simply, as if miraculous healings were perfectly ordinary occurrences in her young life. The drive home from the orphanage passed in a surreal haze of disbelief and desperate hope. Richard's hands gripped the Mercedes steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles showed white against his skin as he navigated the familiar Manhattan streets that suddenly seemed transformed, as if he were seeing his own city through completely new eyes. In the back seat, Emma sat quietly in her car seat, occasionally touching her throat with wonder and opening her mouth as if testing whether her voice might emerge again. Every few minutes, Richard found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, studying his daughter's reflection, and replaying that miraculous moment over and over in his mind. Had he really heard Emma speak? Had his desperation finally reached the point where his brain was manufacturing the sounds he so desperately wanted to hear? But no, Mrs. Patterson had heard it too, her face showing the same shock and amazement that Richard felt coursing through his own system like electricity. "Emma?" he said tentatively, as they stopped at a red light near Central Park. Can you try to say something else, sweetheart?" Emma met his eyes in the mirror, her expression mixing hope with frustration. She opened her mouth deliberately, her lips forming what looked like the beginning of "Daddy," but only air emerged. The effort clearly exhausted her, and she slumped back against her car seat with a small sigh that spoke volumes about the difficulty of her situation. The moment they arrived home, Richard was on the phone with Dr. Walton, pacing his office with manic energy, while Emma played quietly in the adjoining room. "Doctor, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Emma spoke today. She said thank you clearly and distinctly in front of multiple witnesses. I know how this sounds, but I'm not imagining things." Dr. Walton's voice carried the patient tone that medical professionals used when dealing with overwrought parents. "Mr. Hayes, I understand how much you want to believe that Emma has made a breakthrough, but selective mutism often involves brief vocal moments followed by extended periods of silence. One or two words don't necessarily indicate lasting progress. In fact, getting your hopes up prematurely could actually set back her—" "It wasn't a random vocalization," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "She was responding directly to another child, expressing gratitude for a specific action. This was intentional communication, not some involuntary sound." "Even if that's true, Mr. Hayes, sustainable recovery requires understanding the underlying psychological mechanisms. Without addressing the root trauma that caused Emma's mutism in the first place, any spontaneous vocalizations are likely to be temporary. I strongly recommend we proceed with our planned evaluation in Switzerland rather than getting sidetracked by false hope." Richard ended the call more frustrated than before. Dr. Walton's measured professionalism felt inadequate in the face of what he had witnessed. Emma had spoken, not because of expensive therapy or cutting-edge medical treatment, but because a 7-year-old orphan had offered her water from an old plastic bottle. Nothing in his extensive business experience had prepared him for the possibility that the solution to his most pressing problem might come from the most unexpected source imaginable. That evening, as Emma prepared for bed, she surprised Richard by approaching him with one of her children's books, the same story about friendship that they had read the night before. But this time, when he began reading aloud, Emma's lips moved silently along with his words, as if she were practicing the sounds without quite being ready to voice them. Her eyes showed an intensity and focus that hadn't been there before, a sense of determination that gave Richard hope even as it broke his heart. "Are you trying to talk, sweetheart?" he asked gently, setting the book aside to give her his complete attention. Emma nodded emphatically, then pointed to her throat and made a gesture that clearly indicated difficulty or struggle. She was clearly frustrated by her inability to repeat what had happened at the orphanage, but the fact that she was actively attempting to speak represented more progress than Richard had seen in 3 years. Sleep eluded Richard that night as his mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. He had built his fortune by identifying opportunities that others missed, by recognizing patterns and connections that weren't immediately obvious. Now he found himself applying those same analytical skills to his daughter's condition, searching for explanations that made logical sense. By dawn, he had made several decisions. First, he would have the water from Lucy's bottle analyzed by the most sophisticated laboratory his money could buy. Second, he would hire private investigators to research Lucy's background and her grandmother's reputation as a healer. Third, he would arrange for Emma to spend more time with Lucy, regardless of whether conventional medicine could explain what had happened. His research team worked with characteristic efficiency. Within 48 hours, Richard had comprehensive files on both Lucy Martinez and her late grandmother, Maria Santos. The information painted a picture that was both fascinating and deeply troubling. Maria Santos had indeed been renowned throughout the remote regions of Oaxaca as a curandera, whose healing abilities bordered on the miraculous. The documentation included dozens of testimonials from people who claimed she had helped them with conditions ranging from chronic pain to infertility to psychological trauma that conventional medicine had failed to address. Local government officials had investigated her practices multiple times, but had never found evidence of fraud or harmful procedures. More intriguing were the scientific studies that various researchers had attempted to conduct on Maria's methods. Water samples from the spring on her property showed unusual mineral compositions, trace amounts of lithium, magnesium, and several organic compounds that didn't appear in standard groundwater analysis. However, attempts to replicate her healing successes using chemically identical water had failed consistently, leading most scientists to dismiss her reputation as placebo effect combined with coincidence. Maria had died 3 months earlier from complications related to diabetes, leaving Lucy as her only surviving family member. The child had been found living alone in the remote mountain cabin, caring for herself with remarkable self-sufficiency and refusing to leave until authorities agreed to let her bring her grandmother's most precious possessions, several medical journals written in a mixture of Spanish and indigenous Zapotec, and a collection of water vials from the sacred spring. The geological surveys of Maria's property revealed that she had lived atop an underground aquifer system fed by springs that originated deep in the Sierra Madre Mountains. The Mexican government had seized the land after her death, planning to lease it to Corporación Minera del Sur for copper extraction. The sacred spring that had supposedly provided healing water for generations had been buried under 40 tons of concrete and industrial equipment just 2 weeks after Lucy's arrival in New York. Richard stared at the geological reports and satellite imagery spread across his conference table, his mind working through implications and possibilities. If Lucy's water really did possess healing properties, she now possessed the last remaining samples from a source that could never be restored. The weight of that responsibility, preserving something potentially miraculous while caring for a 7-year-old child who had already lost everything else, felt overwhelming. His phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Patterson. Lucy has been asking about Emma constantly. She insists that Emma needs to practice her voice and says the water only works if the person really wants to be heard. I don't pretend to understand what she means, but the child seems genuinely concerned about your daughter's progress. Richard studied the message for a long time, his business instincts warring with his parental desperation. In his world of quantifiable risks and measurable outcomes, everything about this situation defied logical analysis. Yet his daughter had spoken for the first time in 3 years after drinking water from a 7-year-old's bottle. Whatever was happening here transcended normal categories of possibility. "We'll be there this afternoon," he texted back, then called his assistant to clear his schedule for the rest of the week. Emma's reaction to news of another orphanage visit was immediate and dramatic. She ran to her closet and began selecting clothes with the kind of purposeful energy Richard hadn't seen from her in months. She chose her favorite blue dress, the one that brought out her eyes, and insisted on wearing the small silver bracelet that had belonged to her mother. Then she went to her bookshelf and selected the story about the girl who lost her voice to a sea witch, clutching it protectively as if it held special significance. When they arrived at the Sunshine Children's Home, Lucy was waiting by the front entrance with her small backpack and that mysterious vial glinting at her throat. She approached Emma with the confidence of an old friend, as if their previous encounter had established a bond that transcended normal childhood acquaintance. "I knew you'd come back," Lucy said simply, taking Emma's hand with casual familiarity. "Your heart words are getting stronger. I can hear them from here, even though your mouth isn't ready yet." Emma nodded eagerly, squeezing Lucy's hand in a gesture that clearly communicated understanding and gratitude. Richard watched this exchange with growing fascination, noting details that his business training had taught him to observe. The way Emma's posture straightened in Lucy's presence, the alertness in her eyes, the subtle relaxation in her shoulders that suggested she felt safe and understood. Lucy led them to a quiet corner of the orphanage garden, where she had arranged what looked like an elaborate tea party setup. Mismatched plastic cups sat on a small wooden table, accompanied by her ever-present water bottle and a collection of smooth stones arranged in intricate patterns. Everything had been prepared with the kind of careful attention that suggested ritual significance rather than random play. Grandmama taught me that healing is like planting seeds, Lucy explained, as she poured water into 2 small cups with ceremonial precision. You can't make them grow faster by pulling on them, but you can give them good soil and clean water and lots of patience. She handed 1 cup to Emma, who accepted it without hesitation, but paused before drinking. This time Emma looked directly at Richard, then at Lucy, and he could see something remarkable in his daughter's expression. Determination mixed with hope, as if she had made a conscious decision to fight for her voice, rather than simply hoping it would return. "The first time your voice was surprised to be heard," Lucy continued, her green eyes focusing on Emma with unusual intensity. "Now we need to teach it how to stay, but only if you really want it to. Sometimes people get comfortable with being quiet, and their voices need permission to come back." Emma lifted the cup to her lips and drank slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving Lucy's face. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Richard found himself holding his breath, his heart hammering with the same desperate hope that had sustained him through 3 years of medical consultations and failed treatments. Then Emma set down the cup carefully, looked directly at Richard, and spoke 2 words that shattered his world completely. "Hi, Daddy." This time Richard knew with absolute certainty that what he was witnessing wasn't coincidence, wasn't his imagination, and wasn't some temporary fluke. His daughter had deliberately chosen to speak, and somehow this extraordinary little girl named Lucy had given her the key to unlock her voice. As he knelt on the garden grass and pulled Emma into his arms, Richard realized that everything he thought he knew about healing, about medicine, and about the nature of miracles was about to change forever. The following weeks transformed the Hayes mansion from a monument to silence into something Richard had never dared to imagine, a home filled with the gradual emergence of his daughter's voice. Emma spoke in careful, measured sentences at first, as if testing each word, before releasing it into the world like a precious bird that might never return if frightened away. Her vocabulary expanded daily, revealing the sophisticated intelligence that had been locked away for 3 agonizing years, and Richard found himself hanging on every syllable with the desperate attention of a man who had learned never to take speech for granted. "Daddy, why do people think money can fix everything?" Emma asked one morning over breakfast, her small fingers wrapped around a cup of orange juice, as she studied his face with those penetrating brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The question caught Richard completely off guard, not just because of its philosophical sophistication, but because it struck at the very foundation of everything he had built his life upon. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" he responded carefully, setting down his coffee cup and giving her his complete attention. This was still such a miraculous novelty, having actual conversations with his daughter, instead of one-sided monologues punctuated by her gestured responses. "Nobody told me that," Emma said with the matter-of-fact directness that children possessed. "I watched. I listened to all those doctors when they thought I couldn't understand, because I wasn't talking. They only came to see me because you paid them lots and lots of money, but they never really looked at me, not like Lucy did." The observation hit Richard like a physical blow, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable truth about his approach to Emma's condition. Had his wealth actually become a barrier to genuine care? Had expensive specialists seen dollar signs instead of a suffering child? The possibility that his money had been part of the problem rather than the solution was almost too painful to contemplate. Richard had arranged for Lucy to visit their penthouse 3 times a week, ostensibly for supervised playdates, but really to ensure Emma's continued vocal progress. Each visit had become a sacred ritual that Richard observed with the fascination of a scientist, studying a phenomenon that defied all logical explanation. Lucy would arrive with her small backpack, always containing that precious water bottle, and within minutes Emma's confidence would visibly expand, her voice growing stronger and more natural. But Richard's extensive private investigation had uncovered information that kept him awake at night, with worry and determination in equal measure. The Mexican government had seized Maria Santos's remote mountain property just 6 weeks after her death, selling the mineral rights to Corporación Minera del Sur for $43 million. The sacred spring that had supposedly provided healing water for countless generations had been systematically destroyed, buried under tons of concrete and industrial equipment as mining crews prepared to extract copper from the aquifer system that had fed the spring for millennia. Mr. Hayes, his head of security, James Morrison, reported during their weekly briefing in Richard's private office. Morrison was a former Secret Service agent whose discretion and efficiency had made him invaluable for handling Richard's most sensitive investigations. Based on Lucy's current consumption patterns and the volume of water remaining in her possession, we estimate she has approximately 10 to 12 days' worth of the original spring water left. After that, Morrison didn't need to finish the sentence. After that, there would be no more miraculous water from a source that could never be restored, and Richard couldn't bear the thought of Emma retreating back into the prison of silence that had defined their lives for so long. The possibility haunted his dreams and consumed his waking thoughts with an intensity that surprised him with its desperation. "I want to purchase the Mexican mining operation," Richard declared, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had built his business empire. "Whatever the cost. If there's any possibility of accessing that aquifer system or finding alternative sources, I want to control every aspect of the situation." Margaret, his longtime assistant, shifted uncomfortably in her chair as she reviewed the preliminary financial projections. "Sir, acquiring Corporación Minera del Sur would require approximately $420 million, and that's assuming they're even willing to sell. The geological surveys indicate that the mining operation has caused irreversible damage to the underground water system. Even if we owned the property, the likelihood of restoring the spring's original properties is virtually zero, according to every expert we've consulted." Richard stared out at the Manhattan skyline, his mind calculating risks and probabilities with the cold precision that had made him one of the most successful corporate raiders in history. $400 million to possibly save his daughter's voice was an astronomical gamble by any rational business standard. But rationality had abandoned him the moment Emma spoke her first word, and he was prepared to bankrupt himself if necessary to preserve her miraculous recovery. That afternoon, Richard watched from his office window as Emma and Lucy sat in the private garden that occupied the mansion's rooftop. Lucy was teaching Emma some kind of intricate game involving the arrangement of colored stones in complex patterns, while they shared careful sips from the increasingly precious water bottle. Their laughter drifted up to him through the bulletproof glass, a sound more valuable than all the corporate acquisitions and profit margins that had previously defined his existence. Lucy had a way of making Emma feel completely comfortable and understood that Richard envied with surprising intensity. When she was with Lucy, Emma's speech flowed naturally without the hesitation and self-consciousness that still marked her interactions with adults. It was as if Lucy possessed some magical ability to see past Emma's trauma directly to the brilliant, articulate child who had been waiting patiently to emerge. "Mr. Hayes?" Margaret's voice interrupted his observations. "I have the geological survey results you requested from the team in Mexico. The mineral analysis of Lucy's water shows some truly unusual properties, trace amounts of lithium, magnesium, and several organic compounds that don't appear in any standard groundwater analysis. But, sir, the scientists are completely baffled. They can't explain how these particular mineral combinations could produce the neurological effects you've described." Richard studied the thick folder of technical reports, pages upon pages of chemical formulas and scientific jargon that might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit for all the practical guidance they provided. Somewhere buried in these incomprehensible numbers lay the secret to his daughter's miraculous recovery, but the answer remained frustratingly elusive, despite the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had spent on analysis. The phone rang, interrupting his review of the geological data. "Mrs." Patterson's familiar voice carried a note of concern that immediately put Richard on high alert. "Mr. Hayes, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but Lucy has been asking to speak with you privately. She says there's something important about the water that she needs to tell you, something her grandmother made her promise to share when the time was right." 20 minutes later, Richard sat across from Lucy in his private study, the 7-year-old looking impossibly small in the massive leather chair that dominated his executive office. Emma was nearby in the adjacent playroom, building an elaborate castle with her blocks and humming softly to herself, another new development that filled Richard's heart with joy every time he heard it. "Mr. Hayes," Lucy began with the serious tone she adopted when discussing her grandmother's teachings, "I need to tell you something very important about the water that Grandmama made me promise to keep secret until I found the right person to share it with." Richard leaned forward attentively, noting the way Lucy's small hands gripped the arms of the leather chair and the unusual intensity in her green eyes. "I'm listening, Lucy. You can tell me anything." "My grandmama made me promise something before she died," Lucy continued, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "She said I would meet someone who needed the water more than anyone else had ever needed it, and when I found that person, I would have to decide whether to help them or save the water for someone who might need it even more later." A chill ran down Richard's spine as he began to understand the magnitude of the responsibility that had been placed on this child's shoulders. "How much water do you have left, Lucy?" "Maybe enough for 8 more days if Emma only has a little bit each time like we've been doing," Lucy replied, with matter-of-fact honesty that somehow made the devastating news even more difficult to process. "But that's not the most important part. The most important part is what Grandmama taught me about how the water really works." Emma looked up from her blocks, sensing the shift in conversational tone that indicated something significant was being discussed. She abandoned her castle and came over to climb into Richard's lap, a gesture of trust and affection that still felt miraculous to him every single time it happened. "Tell me everything," Richard said quietly, his arms tightening protectively around Emma as he prepared to hear whatever devastating truth Lucy was about to share. Lucy reached into her small backpack and carefully withdrew a thick, leather-bound journal that showed obvious signs of age and extensive use. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the pages within were filled with different handwriting styles, some in neat Spanish script, others in symbols that Richard didn't recognize, and occasional English phrases scattered throughout like breadcrumbs in a linguistic forest. "Grandmama wrote down everything she learned in her whole life," Lucy explained, opening the journal carefully to reveal pages covered in detailed diagrams, pressed flowers, and annotations in multiple languages. All her secrets about healing and the special properties of different waters. But most of it is written in Zapotec, because that was the language her grandmother taught her, and some is in Spanish. I can read some of it, but not all of it. Richard stared at the ancient journal with growing excitement and trepidation. Here, quite possibly, lay the scientific explanation for Emma's recovery, centuries of accumulated knowledge about natural healing that modern medicine had overlooked or dismissed as superstition. "The water doesn't actually make people better by itself," Lucy continued, pointing to a particular page filled with intricate drawings of plants and mineral formations. "It helps them remember something they forgot about themselves. Grandmama called it agua de memoria, memory water. She said everyone has a true voice inside them, a way of being that's completely their own, but sometimes terrible things happen that make them forget how to use their voice or trust their own heart." The explanation sent Richard's mind racing with implications. If Lucy was correct, then Emma's recovery wasn't about chemical healing in the traditional sense. It was about removing psychological barriers that had been preventing her natural healing processes from functioning normally. "Lucy," Richard said carefully, "would you allow me to have this journal professionally translated? I know linguistic experts who specialize in indigenous languages and historical documents. If we can understand exactly what your grandmother discovered, we might be able to help other children like Emma." Lucy hesitated for a long moment, hugging the precious journal against her chest with obvious internal conflict. "Grandmama told me to only share the secrets with someone who would use them to help people, not to hurt them or make money from them." "I want to help Emma," Richard said simply, his voice carrying absolute sincerity. "And maybe we can help other children who have lost their voices too. But I promise you this, if we discover how to replicate your grandmother's healing methods, we'll make sure that knowledge is available to everyone who needs it, not just people who can afford expensive treatments." Emma looked up at her father with those wise brown eyes, then turned to Lucy with an expression of trust and gratitude that spoke volumes about their unique friendship. "Lucy helped me find my voice when nobody else could," she said softly, Maybe we can help other kids find their voices too." Lucy smiled, the same mysterious, knowing expression that had captivated Richard from their very first meeting, and handed the journal to him with ceremonial gravity. "Okay, but you have to promise me something important. If we figure out Grandmama's secrets, we have to share them with everyone, not just rich people. She always said healing should be like water. It should flow freely to wherever it's needed most." Richard accepted the journal with the same reverence he might have shown a priceless artifact, understanding that he now held something far more valuable than any business contract or financial instrument he had ever signed. "I promise, Lucy. On my daughter's life, I promise." That night, Richard held the ancient journal in his private study and realized he was literally holding centuries of accumulated wisdom about human healing that modern science had either lost or never discovered in the first place. The weight of responsibility felt enormous, not just for Emma's continued recovery, but for the potential to unlock healing secrets that could help thousands of children around the world. Time was running out. The sacred water that had given Emma back her voice was nearly exhausted, and the source could never be restored. But somewhere in the pages of Maria Santos's lifetime of research lay the key to understanding how ancient wisdom could be combined with modern resources to create something unprecedented, a bridge between traditional healing and contemporary medicine that could change everything. Dr. Helena Vasquez arrived at the Hayes mansion on a crisp October morning, her academic credentials impressive enough to command Richard's immediate respect and her reputation for discretion absolute enough to trust with secrets that could reshape modern medicine. As Stanford University's leading expert in Mesoamerican linguistic anthropology, she had spent the better part of 2 decades studying indigenous healing traditions and translating historical documents that preserved ancient knowledge systems. Richard had flown her to New York first class and installed her in the mansion's private guest wing, with instructions to translate Maria Santos's journal with the same meticulous attention that archaeologists brought to deciphering Dead Sea Scrolls. For 3 intensive days, Dr. Vasquez had been closeted in Richard's private library with the worn leather journal, occasionally emerging to request specific reference materials or to ask Lucy clarifying questions about symbols and phrases that appeared nowhere in conventional linguistic databases. "This is absolutely extraordinary, Doctor," Vasquez announced during their morning briefing, her usually composed academic demeanor showing signs of genuine excitement that she was struggling to contain professionally. Maria Santos wasn't simply a traditional healer operating on intuition and folklore. She was a keeper of pre-Columbian medical knowledge that represents centuries of systematic observation and experimentation. Richard leaned forward in his chair, Emma curled up beside him with one of her advanced mathematics workbooks, while Lucy sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, organizing her collection of small stones, according to some complex pattern that seemed to hold deep significance for her. "According to these detailed notes, Dr. Vasquez continued, opening the journal to pages covered with intricate botanical illustrations and chemical formulas that looked surprisingly sophisticated for pre-modern indigenous science. The spring water functions as a delivery system for specific mineral compounds that affect neurotransmitter production in the brain. But the water itself isn't the actual cure. It serves as a catalyst that activates dormant healing pathways." The explanation aligned perfectly with what Lucy had told them, but hearing it confirmed by a respected academic gave Richard hope that they might be able to understand and replicate the healing process. "Can the effects be reproduced?" he asked bluntly. Dr. Vasquez exchanged a meaningful look with Lucy before answering, her expression mixing scientific fascination with obvious concern about the implications of what she was about to reveal. That's where the situation becomes considerably more complex than simple chemistry. The journal indicates very clearly that successful healing requires what Maria calls el don del reconocimiento, the gift of recognition. The healer must possess an intuitive ability to identify which specific compounds each individual needs based on their unique psychological and physical condition. Lucy looked up from her stones, her green eyes taking on that peculiar intensity that Richard had learned to recognize as a sign that she was accessing knowledge that went far beyond her chronological age. Grandmama spent years teaching me to listen with my heart instead of just my ears. When I look at someone, I can feel what's broken inside them, what's blocking their natural healing. That's how I knew Emma's voice was trapped, not gone forever. Richard stared at the 7-year-old, processing implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about medical diagnosis and treatment. You're saying Lucy can identify medical conditions through intuition. Not medical conditions in the conventional sense, Dr. Vasquez clarified carefully. More like emotional or psychological barriers that manifest as physical symptoms. According to the journal, this diagnostic ability is hereditary and extraordinarily rare. Maria spent her entire adult life training Lucy to recognize these patterns and understand how different mineral combinations can support the body's natural healing processes. Emma had been listening quietly to the adult conversation, but now she spoke up with the kind of direct question that only children dared to ask. "Lucy, when you look at me right now, what do you see?" Lucy studied Emma carefully, her gaze becoming unfocused in the way that suggested she was perceiving something beyond ordinary visual observation. "Your voice is strong now, and getting stronger every day. But it's still scared sometimes, like it's worried about being taken away again. And there's something else." She tilted her head, concentrating with obvious effort. "You're worried about me." Emma nodded solemnly, her mature emotional intelligence evident in the way she articulated her concerns. "I'm worried about what happens when the water runs out. I'm worried that I'll stop talking again and that you'll think it's your fault." The question that had been haunting Richard for weeks hung heavy in the air between them. Lucy had perhaps a week's worth of water remaining, and despite hiring the most expensive geological teams and consulting with the world's leading hydrogeologists, they had found no viable way to restore the buried spring or locate alternative sources with identical properties. "There might be another solution, Doctor," Vasquez said carefully, her voice carrying the cautious tone that academics used when presenting theories that hadn't been fully tested. According to the journal, Maria identified several other water sources throughout Central and South America with similar healing properties. Sacred springs that carry comparable mineral compositions and have been considered holy by indigenous peoples for countless generations. Richard's entrepreneurial instincts immediately shifted into strategic planning mode, his mind already calculating logistics, costs, and timelines. Where exactly? How quickly could we mount expeditions to test these alternative sources? Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, and possibly Ecuador, Dr. Vasquez replied, consulting her detailed notes. "But Mr. Hayes, these aren't tourist destinations that you can simply fly to with a corporate credit card. Some of these springs are located in extremely remote areas, controlled by indigenous communities, who have excellent historical reasons to distrust outsiders, especially wealthy Americans who arrive with promises and leave with valuable resources." Lucy had been listening intently to the conversation, and now she stood up with the kind of sudden determination that suggested she had reached an important decision. "We have to go find them. Grandmama told me there were others like us, other keepers of the old knowledge who guard different sacred springs. She made me memorize their names and the locations of their communities in case something ever happened to our spring." Richard felt his protective paternal instincts flare with immediate alarm. "Lucy, you're 7 years old. I can't possibly take you into potentially dangerous remote locations where—" "You can't do this without me," Lucy interrupted with startling firmness, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for such a young child to possess naturally. "The keepers won't trust you if you show up alone. They'll think you're just another rich American who wants to steal their secrets and sell them for profit. But they'll listen to me because I carry Grandmama's knowledge and speak the old languages." Emma slipped her small hand into Richard's, her grip surprisingly strong for such delicate fingers. "Daddy, I want to help too. Maybe there are other kids like me somewhere who need to find their voices, and we could help them the way Lucy helped me." Dr. Vasquez closed the journal thoughtfully, her academic mind clearly working through possibilities and implications. "There's something else you should understand before making any decisions about expeditions. According to Maria's detailed notes, Lucy's gift isn't limited to identifying healing needs. She also has the ability to teach others to recognize these same patterns. The journal describes creating what Maria calls un círculo de conocimiento, a circle of knowledge that could potentially help thousands of people. Richard looked around his study at these three remarkable women: a distinguished scientist, a brilliant child who had found her voice against all odds, and a 7-year-old orphan who carried centuries of healing wisdom in her young mind. 2 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been quarterly profit reports and competitive positioning in the global marketplace. Now he was contemplating mounting expeditions into remote jungles to preserve ancient knowledge that could potentially revolutionize modern medicine. "If we undertake something like this," Richard said slowly, his voice carrying the careful deliberation he used when making decisions that would affect thousands of employees and billions of dollars, "we do it properly. Full security teams, medical support, diplomatic clearances through appropriate government channels, and we establish a foundation to ensure this knowledge is preserved and shared responsibly." Lucy smiled, the same mysterious, knowing expression that had captured Richard's attention from their very first meeting at the orphanage. "Grandmama always told me that the sacred waters choose their own path through the world. I think the water chose you, Mr. Hayes, because you have the power to make sure everyone can benefit from the healing, not just people who can afford expensive doctors." Emma squeezed her father's hand and looked up at him with absolute trust and confidence. "And the water chose me because I needed to learn how to use my voice to help other people, not just for myself." That night, as Richard made the phone calls that would set their unprecedented expedition in motion, he realized that his daughter's recovery had been merely the opening chapter of a much larger story. They were about to embark on a journey that could unlock healing secrets that had been preserved for centuries by indigenous communities, guided by a 7-year-old girl who carried the accumulated wisdom of generations in her young heart. The impossible had already happened once when Emma found her voice. Richard was beginning to believe that impossible things might be far more common than he had ever dared to imagine, especially when ancient wisdom combined with modern resources and genuine intention to help others rather than exploit them for profit. 6 months later, Richard stood at the podium of the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva, looking out at an audience of medical professionals, researchers, government officials, and journalists from around the globe. The magnificent assembly hall buzzed with anticipatory energy as representatives from 43 countries waited to hear about discoveries that preliminary reports suggested could revolutionize approaches to pediatric psychological medicine and trauma recovery. Behind him, a massive presentation screen displayed images that told the story of their remarkable journey. Crystal-clear springs nestled in remote mountain valleys, indigenous healers working alongside modern scientists in state-of-the-art research facilities, and children from every continent who had found their voices through a revolutionary combination of ancient wisdom and contemporary medical understanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the confident authority that had made him one of the world's most successful business leaders, but now infused with a deeper purpose that transcended mere financial success. "I want to tell you about the most important discovery of my life, one that came not from corporate laboratories or clinical trials, but from a 7-year-old girl who understood something about healing that we had forgotten." In the front row of the assembly hall, Emma sat beside Lucy, both girls wearing matching blue dresses that Richard had commissioned from a designer who specialized in formal wear for children attending international diplomatic functions. They shared a water bottle between them, not the sacred water which had been carefully preserved for research purposes, but ordinary spring water that had become special simply because they shared it with the same spirit of friendship and mutual support that had sparked Emma's original recovery. Emma's transformation over the past 6 months had been nothing short of miraculous. Her voice had grown strong and clear, her confidence had blossomed with each new challenge she overcame, and she had become Lucy's partner in what they called heart listening, the process of helping other children identify and overcome the emotional barriers that manifested as physical or psychological symptoms. "The Santos Foundation," Richard continued, clicking to the next slide which showed architectural plans for healing centers that blended traditional indigenous design with cutting-edge medical facilities, has partnered with indigenous healers, modern scientists, and local communities to establish comprehensive healing centers at each sacred spring location we've discovered and authenticated. The expedition to Guatemala had been the first of many, each journey building upon the knowledge gained from previous discoveries. Working with Dr. Vasquez and a carefully assembled team of anthropologists, geologists, medical researchers, and cultural liaison specialists, they had located and authenticated 4 additional sacred springs. Each site had been protected by indigenous communities who had guarded their healing knowledge for countless generations, waiting for the right opportunity to share their wisdom with the broader world. The presentation showed photographs of the healing centers, beautiful facilities that honored traditional architectural styles while incorporating modern medical equipment and research capabilities. Indigenous healers worked side by side with trained physicians, combining centuries-old diagnostic techniques with contemporary scientific analysis. Children with various conditions came from around the world, not seeking miracle cures, but participating in a revolutionary form of holistic treatment that addressed psychological, emotional, and physical healing as interconnected aspects of overall wellness. Our success rate currently stands at 91%, Richard announced, the statistics representing far more than mere numbers to him. Each percentage point represented children who had found their voices, overcome trauma, or discovered healing that conventional medicine had been unable to provide. Not because we've discovered magical properties in these waters, but because we've learned to treat human beings as complete integrated systems rather than collections of isolated symptoms. Lucy had indeed possessed the extraordinary gift that her grandmother had recognized and cultivated. Under careful scientific observation and documentation, she had demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify emotional and psychological barriers that manifested as physical symptoms in children. More remarkably, she had proven capable of teaching others to develop similar sensitivities through intensive training programs that combined traditional indigenous techniques with modern psychological understanding. Dr. Vasquez had published groundbreaking research on the mineral compositions of the sacred springs, leading to new scientific understanding of how specific natural compounds could support neurological healing when combined with appropriate psychological intervention. But the real breakthrough had been recognizing that sustainable healing required more than just biochemistry. It demanded human connection, cultural respect, and the kind of intuitive wisdom that Lucy represented. The program operates on principles of accessibility and cultural partnership, Richard continued, addressing concerns that had been raised about exploitation of indigenous knowledge and commercialization of traditional healing practices. Treatment is provided free of charge to any family in need, regardless of their economic circumstances or geographic location. Indigenous communities retain full ownership and control over their sacred sites, and all research findings are shared openly with the global medical community. Emma stood up from her seat and walked confidently to the podium, her poise remarkable for a 7-year-old, addressing world leaders and medical experts. Richard lifted her up so she could reach the microphone, remembering the profound silence that had defined their relationship just 6 months earlier. "Hi, everyone," Emma said, her voice clear and strong as it carried throughout the assembly hall. "My name is Emma Hayes, and until I met Lucy, I was afraid to use my voice because I thought if I spoke, something terrible might happen again like when my mommy died." Her words created complete silence in the assembly hall as hundreds of adults leaned forward to listen to this remarkable child who had become the face of an entirely new approach to childhood trauma recovery. "Lucy taught me that my voice was never broken," Emma continued, her confidence growing with each word. "It was just hiding because it was scared. The special water didn't fix me. Lucy did by helping me remember that I was never broken in the first place. We want to help other kids remember they're not broken either, even when terrible things happen to them." Lucy joined them at the podium, her green eyes sparkling with the wisdom that had captivated Richard from their very first meeting at the orphanage. "My grandmama always said that healing is like planting seeds in good soil. You can't make them grow faster by pulling on them, but you can give them clean water and lots of love and patience while they remember how to grow." The standing ovation that erupted throughout the assembly hall lasted for several minutes, but Richard barely heard it. He was looking at his daughter, brilliant, articulate, compassionate Emma, and the extraordinary girl who had given her back her voice and so much more. Lucy had become part of their family through formal adoption proceedings that had ensured she could continue her healing work while receiving the education, stability, and love that every child deserved. Later that evening, as they celebrated at an elegant restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva, Emma raised her glass of sparkling cider in a toast that captured the spirit of their remarkable journey. To Lucy, for teaching me that miracles aren't magic. They're just love and ancient wisdom working together to help people remember who they really are inside. Lucy clinked her glass against Emma's, then looked at Richard with a smile that reminded him of that transformative first day at the orphanage when everything had changed forever. Grandmama always said the sacred waters would find their way to where they needed to go most. I think she would be happy that the water found us and helped us find each other. Richard raised his own glass, thinking about the incredible journey that had begun with his desperate desire to hear his daughter speak and had evolved into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. To new beginnings, ancient wisdom, and the power of believing that impossible things are possible when we combine love with action. As they shared their toast, Richard reflected on how completely his understanding of wealth and success had been transformed. His business empire continued to thrive, but now it served a fundamentally different purpose, funding research that bridged traditional and modern healing approaches, supporting indigenous communities in preserving and sharing their cultural knowledge, and ensuring that breakthrough discoveries would benefit everyone rather than just those who could afford premium medical care. Emma had found her voice, but more importantly, she had learned to use it as an advocate for other children who needed hope and healing. Lucy had honored her grandmother's legacy while building an unprecedented bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding, creating opportunities for knowledge systems that had been isolated for centuries to contribute to global healing efforts. The sacred springs continued to flow, now protected by international treaties and indigenous rights legislation that Richard had personally lobbied for through his extensive political and business connections. Children from every continent came to the healing centers, and many found not just symptom relief, but emotional freedom and the courage to become their most authentic selves. That night, as Emma and Lucy shared a room in their luxurious hotel suite, Richard could hear them talking softly about their dreams for the future, training more healers, establishing additional centers, and spreading the message that every child deserves to be heard, understood, and healed holistically, rather than treated as a collection of symptoms to be managed. The silence that had once defined the Hayes household had been replaced by something infinitely more precious, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the preservation of ancient knowledge for future generations, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their personal miracle had become a doorway for thousands of other families to find healing and hope. Emma had indeed found her voice, but the real miracle was that she was using it to amplify the voices of others who needed to be heard. The sacred waters had chosen their path wisely, flowing from an ancient spring through the hands of a remarkable child to create ripples of healing that would continue expanding throughout the world for generations to come.